Hello and welcome. I am working on the next part of my Dollhouse project, and I decided that the thing that was most needful next was bedding. So I have made a little fox doll so far, and I have made a little 3D printed bed with a mattress. But I decided that we really needed to make it feel a little bit more complete with some bedding. And I decided the first thing to work on was a knitted blanket. So I am a knitter and I love knitting. And I feel like a knitted blanket gives a really nice feel to a little dolly's bed, and it is a little bit of a different experience with a dollhouse doll, just because for me to use a standard weight yarn, it is in reality a very chunky blanket for that doll. But I have this little acrylic cotton blend which I used, and I feel like it turned out really nice. I've made it just in garter stitch, which I think has worked quite well, and it's not excessively large. I've made it so it just tips past the edges just slightly, and obviously it won't hang the same way that a blanket would on a full-size bed, but I like the effect that it's come out with. It's a slightly variegated yarn, so it has some greens and blues in this piece, and I feel like it worked quite nicely. The next thing I want to work on is a quilt. It's a very interesting thing to make a quilt for a tiny bed like this. Like, I'm a quilter and I love to make quilts. And in the past, when I've made tiny quilts, I have substituted a standard wadding for some flannelette, but this time I actually just didn't put anything in the middle. I've just made a front and a back. And you can tell that I super wasn't feeling the measuring today, because I've just cut out some random size squares and I'm going to put them together just from my scrap boxes. So even though it doesn't really matter on a project this small, I'm doing some chain piecing. The main reason that I love chain piecing like this is that you can't get your placements mixed up very easily. It's like very easy to keep this all together. Everything stays aligned, and it's quick and easy to just put everything together. I have a long history of making quilts for dollies. I feel like little quilts and pillows for dollies were some of the first things that I sewed when I was a little kid and I was a beginner sewer. But also, as I have gotten more excited about the quilting part of quilting, and done more free motion quilting and things like that, dolly quilts have been my go-to for playing and practicing and trying new ideas. But for this little quilt, because it is just so simple and I wanted it to be very well held, I am just doing some straight line stitching, fairly close together, just covering the whole thing over and going in both directions. And that way the quilt is very held, and it doesn't really have any puffiness to it because I didn't put any flannelette in it, but I regret it ever so slightly, but I feel like the effect is fine. Like, it has worked quite well, and I can always make more dollhouse quilts, because I think I'm enjoying this project and I can see myself making more in the future. I have started a few other little bits and pieces for it, so we'll see how it all goes. But I feel like the way that this has turned out is pretty good, and I'm relatively happy with it. I decided to do not a proper binding that I would normally do, but pretty close. So I could have just folded the excess of the backing over to bind the edges in, but I decided it was going to be a neater finish and more of the look that I enjoy if I added a separate binding onto it. So I've just cut a strip, and I'm just attaching it to the back. I haven't folded it over at all, I've kept it open, but I'm just doing some basic corners and just getting that in place, and then I will fold things over and top stitch it. I am one of those quilters who machine sews their binding on. I feel like there isn't any enjoyment in a hand sewn binding for me, and I feel like you can get a nice finish with a machine sewn binding. So I always attach the binding to the back of the quilt and then stitch it from the front, and I feel like that gives the nicest look, and it means that I can finish quilts quite quickly. I'm the sort of person who can get stuck in the finishing stages, and I don't see any point in having a quilt that you've put so many hours into stuck in the not quite finished pile because you can't get the binding on. So that is how I do it, and this worked out quite well. I ended up having to trim the seams a little bit just because I didn't measure anything and I just needed a little bit more space to sew the binding down. But I'm quite happy with how it has gone, and so I'm just working around on this, just folding it as I go, keeping it tidy, mitering the corners a little bit so that that is all neat and tidy, making sure my needle is down just so I can pivot in each corner so I can keep going round and round and getting this all finished. The last part that I decided was needful for this initial set of linen for this tiny little bed is a little pillow. And I just chose one of the fabrics that I used in the quilt and just eyeballed a nice size. I did contemplate making like an inner pillow with a pillow cover to go over the top, and it may be something that I do with some future linen sets, but for this one I just did a simple sew around it, turn it through and stuff it. So I started putting the stuffing in, but I realized I didn't want it to be very hard stuffed, so I separated out the fibers just so that it could be very lightly stuffed with them spread evenly throughout the pillow, because little foxes don't need a lot of firm pillows to be comfortable. They just need a little bit of a pillow. I have seen some people just use like a couple of layers of wadding in a doll pillow, and I feel like that could be good as well, but it makes a much flatter pillow, and I think that I prefer the more rounded look to the pillow. The last bit of finishing after that is sewn up is I forgot to sew the ends in on this little knitted blanket, and that is another of the finishing things that sometimes I get caught up on. I might knit something to almost completion, but there may be a few ends to hide or some sewing up, which gets me a bit stuck. Thanks for joining me in my adventure in trying to make my own dollhouse all from scratch. And if you're working on a great project, please share it in the comments because I love to be inspired by what other people are making. And I'm not sure what we're going to be making next, but I'm excited. Bye.